Muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I serve as the Director of Training and Education for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I would like to welcome all of you to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the Police Data Initiative. Before we officially begin, I would like to discuss a few housekeeping items. During the call today, all attendees will be muted. As soon as we begin, however, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have for today's webinar. When we come to the question and answer portion of the webinar, your questions will be asked and answered as they have been received. During the webinar, you may also send any questions you might have for me as the webinar administrator in the same manner. At the conclusion of the webinar, each of you will be given the opportunity to complete a brief survey on today's event. If you could please take a few moments to complete the survey, it will help us as we move forward with enhancing and expanding our webinar series. With this out of the way, I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Jim Burch. Mr. Burch is Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Police Foundation, overseeing the Foundation's efforts to advance policing through innovations in practices and technology, as well as the Foundation's strategic programs and management services. Prior to joining the Police Foundation in early 2015, Mr. Burch served for more than 20 years at the U.S. Department of Justice. During his time there, he developed, supported, and led many key initiatives to advance policing and criminal justice, including major initiatives designed to encourage the use of data, technology, and evidence-based crime reduction and policing strategies. These initiatives focused on improving officer safety and on information sharing policy initiatives and strategies. This work and experience plays into the work that he now does for the Foundation, and in particular his work with the Police Data Initiative. I will now turn things over to Mr. Burch, who will also be introducing today's special guest.
Well, thank you very much, Cameron, and thanks to everybody around the country for participating in this webinar today. We're really excited to talk to you about the Police Data Initiative. It's an initiative that has gotten quite a bit of attention over the last year, but even in the last few weeks has really begun to garner a lot more attention and initiative around the country. Different agencies have been emailing us to join the initiative, so it's a very exciting time for the Police Data Initiative. The Police Foundation, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're an organization that's been around for almost 46 years now. We were created after a period of civil unrest in the U.S. in the late 1960s. And we were created for the purpose of helping law enforcement advance in terms of the profession and the way that the profession does business. And our specific mission was, or is, to do that by leveraging both innovation and science. So we see the Police Data Initiative and the subject of open data, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes, as a key way to do that. It is definitely an innovation, and it fosters innovation. And at the same time, it can build trust and respect within the community. It also provides a great tool for accountability, for people to be able to see exactly what is happening in their communities and what the police department is doing in response. But let me stop there before I go too much further talking about the Police Data Initiative. We do have a special guest with us today. Denise Ross is a Presidential Innovation Fellow at the White House. And Denise has been involved in the Police Data Initiative since day one, when it was launched in 2015. And prior to that, Denise worked in New Orleans, where she worked for a nonprofit organization that worked very closely with the city to open up data there. So she's got a lot of practical on-the-ground experience as well. Denise, are you with us?
I am. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Would you, Jim, would you like me to give a little bit of the background on the initiative?
Yeah, please tell us about so where it comes from within the White House and who's been involved in it and what it means for the White House.
Great, absolutely. So the Police Data Initiative is a community of practice of law enforcement agencies partnered often with their municipal tech and IT counterparts to open data about the activities of policing. So that's not necessarily data about crime, but more data on police activities like officer-involved shootings, use of force, community meetings attended, trainings attended, police force demographics, that type of thing. And the initiative emerged as one of the early tangible responses to the President's task force on 21st century policing recommendations. And there were 59 recommendations in that report. 14 of them had to do with data, technology, or transparency. And of course, building community trust was woven throughout the findings of that report. And so I'm so excited to be here today because we are looking for additional jurisdictions to help lead the way in this uncharted territory of defining what open data in policing looks like and how to best build the context around the data that you're publishing and use that data as a platform for engaging community and building community trust. We are currently at 42 jurisdictions. We are looking to get to 100 by the end of the year. And of course, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. But what we're looking for is really agencies to lead the way and help define this space in collaboration with great groups like the Police Foundation.
Thanks, Denise. And as I mentioned, Denise has been involved in this work in the Police Data Initiative since it was launched in 2015. And prior to that, she worked at the local level doing some really interesting open data work that continues today in New Orleans. We had a webinar with Denise a couple of weeks ago, and we had the, I believe it's the CIO from the city who also involved in that work. They're telling us about the great work that they're doing. So Cameron, if you would mind advancing us to the next slide. And Denise, as I go through these, feel free to jump in and add your perspective to these. I know a couple of them you covered, so we'll move through these very quickly. But as Denise mentioned, in 2014, the President launched the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. There were a number of those recommendations in the task force report that had to do with data or technology or the issue of transparency. There are 14 to be exact. And we think the Police Data Initiative certainly responds to a lot of those recommendations. Next slide, please. So the Police Data Initiative really, the way it began was with really two components. And this was the subject of a little bit of confusion early on. People didn't quite understand exactly what was happening, but there was a focus with open data and policing, which is the work that the Police Foundation is involved in, really is designed to provide data from police departments to the communities that they work in and to the broader nation to be able to show what is actually taking place. So it's this process of opening up data and sharing it to build community trust, as you can see here on the slide. There was another component to the Police Data Initiative that was focused much more on how law enforcement agencies actually use the data. And so, for example, there were a couple of major city law enforcement agencies that agreed to allow some key data scientists to have access to some of their data to see if there is a way that we could use that data to improve early warning systems, internal accountability, and to decrease inappropriate uses of force within law enforcement. So these were really two separate tracks within the Police Data Initiative. So going forward, for the rest of the webinar, we're going to be talking about the external track, or the track that deals with open data and policing. So that's where the Police Foundation has been involved. And as Denise mentioned, and you can see here, this really is about a community of practice of law enforcement agencies around the country. Cameron, next slide. So a couple of things about what the Police Data Initiative is and is not. I talked a little bit about the external and internal piece. I want to be clear, though, as we talk about law enforcement agencies making data available, I think a number of people initially thought that we were collecting data at the national level or at the federal level, and that's not the case. That's not what's happening. The White House didn't ask, the Department of Justice didn't ask, and the Police Foundation didn't ask for agencies to provide their data to us. I know that's very much the traditional way of doing business, where we at the federal level or at the national level collect data from communities and agencies and then share that back. That's the traditional way of doing business, but that's not what the Police Data Initiative is about. The Police Data Initiative was what we like to call a democratization of data. In other words, these agencies, these individual agencies, release their data into the community and to the nation at large to be able to show everybody what they do every day on behalf of the public. So it is not a centralized database. The other thing is there was some initial confusion about what open data means, and there was some initial thought that as long as we were pushing data out publicly, so if a department releases an annual report or releases some summary statistics about use of force incidents, for example, or racial profiling data of some kind, or data to show that there was not racial profiling, whichever the case may be, that would meet the test of open data. But that's not what open data is. Open data is essentially data that allows access to it and the ability to manipulate it and do something with it. I apologize for the noise in the background. That's not a planned sound effect. That is the byproduct of our office being close to the White House. So we hear sirens all the time in the background here, and I apologize for that. It's not a prop. So data published in a PDF or any other kind of a locked format or a report format or a picture format of a map is not open data. So it essentially doesn't count, if you will, for this initiative. Data that is open is data that is in what we call a machine readable format. So in other words, data that anybody can access and use. That's sometimes a CSV file, which is very similar to a Microsoft Excel kind of file, and a few other formats that are out there for publishing data. In other words, I can download it and I can do whatever I want with it. So if I don't trust the analysis, or if I think there's a different kind of analysis that might be needed, I can do that with that data. And that's the difference between open data and non-open data. The other third point that I want to make about the Police Data Initiative is the focus in this has not been generating data about crimes. While that might be something that an agency releases data on, and that's great, there's no sort of discouragement of agencies releasing data about crime. But what this is really about is releasing data about the activity of policing and about the interactions with citizens that take place every day. That could mean a lot of different things. It could mean the data around the ways in which the police department engages with the community. So for example, we have an agency in Vermont that releases data that talks about or tells you about all the times that police personnel have come to and attended community meetings in some way, and what the duration of their attendance was, the nature of their attendance. All of that is available in an open data format that can be put into a calendar. It could be put into a map to see where in the community the police department has had a presence. That's the kind of data that we're trying to collect here. So you can find data out there that talks about how many homicides or how many shootings or how many burglaries we've had. But what this is really about is what kinds of interactions have law enforcement had with the public. Next slide, Cameron. So this is a map of Police Data Initiative stakeholders. I mentioned early on that that we've had a lot of interest expressed in the last few weeks. So when these slides were prepared just a couple of weeks ago, there were 34 agencies that were participating. So if you count the icons on this map, you should come to 34 or pretty close to it. But as you heard Denise mention, there's 42 agencies now that are participating. That's the kind of interest that has taken place over the last few weeks. The Police Data Initiative, as Denise mentioned, is a community of practice. We have obviously law enforcement agencies involved, but with each one of those law enforcement agencies, there are also many chief technology officers, chief data officers, or for smaller agencies, it could mean someone just in the IT shop that is aware of what's happening and participating in the effort. At the national level, as I mentioned, we've got the White House leading this effort. We heard from Denise Ross earlier. She's been involved since day one. She is a Presidential Innovation Fellow, or was, and that is the group that is behind this effort within the White House. The Police Foundation, is my organization, has been involved in this since its launch, as well as another nonprofit organization, Code for America. The International Association of Chiefs of Police also was involved in this effort from the very beginning and has remained involved in different ways. So there's a number of national organizations involved in this. And then at the local level, again, in addition to the law enforcement agencies and the technology staff, you also have many mayors and city managers who are engaged in this work directly, some researchers, some data scientists. and other organizations from different communities around the country are all taking part in this. So the community of practice is a very broad group. In fact, it's getting so big now that we have to start thinking about a couple of different ways of communicating with them because it's just too many to have on a call. Cameron, can you go to the next slide? So here's a different look at the agencies that are participating. So this is, again, was just from a couple weeks ago, so it's already outdated. There are a lot of new agencies to add to this list, but this gives you a little more specific information about the number of agencies that have come on board. So you can see we're in a lot of different places around the country. We do have a little bit of a gap there in the middle of the country, which we're working hard to fill in. As Denise mentioned, we're well on our way to reaching the goal of 100 agencies participating. And I think given the progress that we've seen just in the last couple of weeks, I think that's going to be pretty easily achieved by the end of this calendar year. Cameron, next slide. So since inception, this says 34, but you know now there's 42 agencies that have joined the Police Data Initiative, and well more than 21 of them have actually released data. At the time that this slide was produced, there were 8 different sets of data, if you will, that is different databases to a sense, that dealt with the issue of officer-involved shootings. So in these 8 data sets from different places around the country, you can go in and see each time a police officer has been involved in a shooting incident, you can get different data about those incidents. You can, in most cases, you can map them so that you can see where they occurred in the community. You can find out the times of day that they occurred. You can also find out other factors about those incidents, including, in some cases, the race and gender of the officer or the suspect, and even some other data as well. There are, there was at the time we produced this, there were 6 agencies releasing calls for service data. So this is anytime someone calls 911, or in some cases 311, to ask for police assistance, that is generated in this calls for service, in these calls for service data set. For some agencies, this calls for service data set is almost real time. So there are some agencies that are telling you within a few hours of a call to the police department for assistance what the nature of that call was and where it took place. Now, obviously, for calls for service and for incidents, which is where a report was taken on an incident that took place, there's some aspects that are not included, and these are for the privacy and protection of privacy of the people who are involved. So these might be certain kinds of domestic violence incidents. They could be sexual assault cases, or things where releasing the information would cause harm to an innocent person. That's the kind of data that you would sometimes not push out in an open data format. But otherwise, it includes all types of incidents and calls for service. You see here, there's a number of agencies. At the time we developed this slide, there were 3 agencies that were releasing data on assaults against officers, so telling you how often that occurs and where it occurs. And then there were 24 agencies that were releasing data, or 24 data sets, I should say, about miscellaneous types of engagement. So you can see in the blue box to the right there on the slide, it provides you more information on what we mean by miscellaneous. So it could be what an agency calls pedestrian or motor vehicle stop data. So that is, they tell us who every person is that stopped in a pedestrian stop or in a motor vehicle stop. Usually you get the race and gender of the person stopped as well as the officer, so that you can do some analysis based on those factors to understand that better. In other cases, it may be employee characteristics. So I believe it's Louisville PD, for example, that releases data on all of the employees in the police department. This does not include their names, but it does include descriptions of the employees so that you can learn how many people in the Louisville Police Department are male, how many are female, how many of them have college degrees, how many years have they been on the department, and you can do analysis based on that data. So in a way, that's like the Louisville Police Department saying, here's some data about us. Here's a way that you can look and see who is actually serving in the police department in Louisville, Kentucky. You also see community engagement. That's the, I believe that's the Rutland Police Department in Vermont that I mentioned, tells you about all the times that they've attended community meetings or participated in some way. Cameron, if you could go to the next slide. So our role at the Police Foundation with the Police Data Initiative is a few different things. One is that I mentioned our mission is to advance policing through innovation and science. We're very focused right now, as is most everyone involved in this profession, on finding ways to build trust and relationships with the community. And so we believe open data is certainly a way to do that. Admittedly, it's not for everyone. Not everyone is going to go online and download data and do analysis of it, but I think there are a lot of people that are, and you'll see here in a few minutes why I think this is so important for us to focus on how open data can really help people understand what policing is all about. At the Police Foundation, we think our role is to provide technical assistance to agencies. So this is, in some ways, a little bit of a challenging process for agencies that don't have a stronger technical background. And so we need sometimes people to help them understand how to get the data out of the systems that they operate and how to put the data in a format so that it can be published in an open way online. Again, as I mentioned previously, without jeopardizing the privacy rights of some of the people who may be implicated in the data. We also think it's important to provide a national demonstration for what's happening in policing. In other words, we think this is a good thing, and we think that the 42 agencies that are participating in this process should be applauded. They should be applauded for opening up their data and sharing and trusting that people will look at this data and help them understand how to do policing better and how to be a better public servant agency, if you will. We also think it's really important to provide context for police data, and this is one of the things that we're doing through our open data portal, which is you see a picture of it there on the right of this slide, and you see a web address here where you can go to it as well and pull up data from the different agencies that are participating in this initiative. We provide context by basically helping to describe what this data means. So for example, people in communities may not understand the distinction between incident data and calls for service data. They may not understand the distinction between racial profiling reports and pedestrian stops and motor vehicle stops. And so this website that we've developed, this portal that you see the web address for here, is really intended to help provide that context and that understanding. It's also important that we provide context around what the data means. So in some cases, agency leaders like Chief Ramsey, for example, who is the co-chair of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, has said numerous times that officer-involved shootings and use of force incidents don't occur in a vacuum. And what he means by that is that these things don't randomly occur around the community geographically or by time or by the people that are involved. If you look at this data, the data of police officer-involved shootings, and overlay it with violent crime data, you'll see a lot of similarities in terms of where these things are occurring. And so we have some of that context on this website for people to understand these issues that may not be apparent from the very beginning. So we want to help provide that link and that bridge between law enforcement and the community. Cameron, if you could go to the next slide for me, I think we'll see some of that context. So this is actually in Dallas. Dallas releases data about officer-involved shootings, and you can see on the left, the slide with the blue dots, each of those dots is an officer-involved shooting that occurred over the course of, I believe this was 2 years worth of data. I may be wrong, it may be 1 year's worth of data. What we did was we took their data on officer-involved shootings, as you can see here, and placed it on the map, and then we also brought in data on violent crimes that occurred. And we did that in more of a heat map style and overlaid that as well. And what you can see is you really do see a lot of similarities between where the officer-involved shootings are occurring and where they're clustering and where the violent crime is clustering. So this really, in some ways, it's not scientific by any means, but it certainly lends credibility to what Chief Ramsey was telling us about the fact that officer-involved shootings aren't occurring in a vacuum. They're occurring in some of the same places that violent crime is occurring. They're occurring often in very dangerous communities. Now, what that means is a whole nother question, and that's something for every community and agency to discuss. But our purpose here was really to show what you can do with open data and how you can help communities understand some of that context. Next slide. So our future plans for us here at the Police Foundation is obviously to continue to advocate for open data in public safety and policing. That's part of our mission. We'll continue to do that going forward. Continue to support the Police Data Initiative. As I mentioned, our goal is to get to 100 agencies by the end of the calendar year, so we are continuing to help push to meet that goal, and we're confident that we'll easily meet it before the end of the calendar year. And then providing guidance and assistance in open data development strategies and technologies, that's something that we do through the community of practice. And we also do it directly with individual agencies that talk to us about joining the Police Data Initiative, and we're happy to do it for any others. If an agency wants to release data but doesn't have the technology support to be able to do it, we can certainly help them figure out how to do that. You don't necessarily need sophisticated software to make this work. And then the last point is we want to encourage more agencies to participate and to release additional data sets. So I mentioned earlier that our goal is to get to 100 agencies by the end of the calendar year. We could have 100 agencies release 2 or 3 data sets, or we could have 100 agencies release 10 or 12 data sets. And the more data they release, I think the more the community can begin to understand what actually takes place in policing. I personally believe that so much of our understanding, our being citizens' understanding of policing, comes from what we've seen in our communities, but also from what we've seen on television, what we've seen in movies, and what we might see on the internet. And frankly, a lot of what we see on the internet and what we see in Hollywood, it doesn't really represent what takes place on the streets every day. So I think the more we can release facts and release data and let communities see for themselves where good things are occurring and where good things need to occur more frequently is really important. And the Open Data Initiative definitely does that. Next slide. So here's the slide that I mentioned earlier. I sort of previewed for you was coming up. And it is sort of why we're doing this, right? And I talked about how it builds community trust, builds accountability. But the other thing is, when I look at this slide, I see the way our future generation is engaging. And you look at what some of these kids are looking at. First of all, I'm impressed by the technology that's in front of them. I mean, I know for myself, being approximately 50 years old, I didn't have these kinds of things growing up when I was their age. So I'm impressed by seeing that. But I'm even more impressed to see what's on the screen. This is some serious data that these kids are looking at, and look how engaged they are in this. They understand it, they know what it means, and this is our future. This is the kind of engagement that we want to see. I see 2 police chiefs in these photographs, and I see them in a very relaxed kind of setting, working together, hand in hand with the community, finding things in their own data that they may not have known existed. You see the chief from New Orleans there. My understanding is that this young lady that's with him, was actually teaching him to write code, that he had never written code previously in computer code, and that she's teaching him how to do that. I think these are a pretty awesome set of pictures, and this is exactly why we should be pursuing open data in policing. That's not to say that the report of the President's task force wasn't enough motivation for us, with 14 recommendations having to do with data and transparency and technology, but seeing these kids engage in this way with law enforcement leaders and the community engaging this way with law enforcement leaders, to me, really underscores why we need to be doing this. Cameron, next slide. So the moment you've all been waiting for. Okay, we've heard enough. How do we get involved? How do we join this initiative? So for law enforcement agencies that are out there, or anyone in city government, or in an IT shop within a government agency, it's pretty straightforward. You just send an email to pdi@policefoundation.org and let us know that your agency wants to participate in this initiative, that you will need buy-in from the mayor or the city manager, the CIO, or someone who oversees technology for the city or the county or the state, and the chief of police or the sheriff. And then step 3 will be to identify 3 data sets that you want to release in an open format. That's what you need to participate. 3 simple steps. We can have you up and running in just a matter of weeks. It's a pretty straightforward process. There's no complicated applications. There's no forms. Again, it's pretty straightforward. And Denise, if she's still with us, Denise wrote a blog that she and I had an opportunity to work on together some time ago that talked about how simple this could be. And one idea that she had was really brilliant, which is you don't need to go out and find or create a new data set. you can simply take a report that you're already releasing and make that data that's in that report available in an open format. Denise, are you still with us? Do you want to comment?
I am, yeah, and that's one of my favorite ways to get on board because the most important element of this work, we've heard time and time again from our jurisdictions, is providing the context around the data and telling the full story. If you've already done that work in your annual report, for example, and that annual report might include rolled up counts of different, use of force and such, and pie charts and graphs. Some analyst behind the scenes has a spreadsheet that can be cleaned up and posted on the website as a companion to the report. And that really adds credibility to the report to back it up with the disaggregated data, and can be used as a starting place for deeper conversations with the public. So then another great place to start is by looking at your public records requests and identifying the data sets that are most in demand by the media and the public, and seeing how you can shift from being reactive in responding to those requests toward being proactive and releasing the data in a disaggregated incident level open format, along with the context and the documentation, so you can fortify the data so it's less likely to be misinterpreted by the public or the media.
Thanks, Denise. Cameron, do you want to, I don't recall if we have a next slide or not. We don't. Okay. So we'll leave this up for now. I think we've gone about 30 minutes, so I'd like to see if there are some questions, Cameron, and then we can kind of, if we need to, if we have time, we can, there's a couple of other things we can show, but if not, I think it'd be great if we could take some questions.
While I'm waiting for some people to type some questions in, I wondered, particularly to this slide, when you talk about how to join the initiative, is this available to civilian oversight agencies, or are you talking about law enforcement agencies specifically?
That's a great question. I don't mean to put Denise on the spot, but Denise, if you're still with
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because we are looking for a diversity of types of agencies to chart the path, toward open data in different situations. That would be, large jurisdictions and small jurisdictions, urban, rural, counties, cities, and I think what the civilian oversight organizations that you're talking about would be a really nice companion to that. The one thing that I will say is that it helps to have some technical infrastructure to tap into, and often you find that in the municipality. So if there's a partnership where you can publish your data, use the city's IT infrastructure to publish that data, sometimes that makes it easier to release the data. But again, you could just release spreadsheets on your website. So we would certainly love to have a different type of organization participating, because the civilian oversight groups have collect such rich information that really is aimed at building community trust.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Well, Jim, at this point, if there's other information that you'd like to share while people are still thinking about their questions, that would be great.
Yeah, if maybe what I could do is, if I could take the screen, I'll show folks what the portal looks like and how you can pull up data.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. So this is, as we mentioned on the site, this is the Public Safety Open Data Portal. This is the site that the Police Foundation has developed to, as I mentioned, showcase what the local agencies are doing. And so when you come to this site, you can go here to see which agencies are participating in the initiative. It'll essentially take you to an expanded view of the map, or you can jump right into some of the data that we've talked about. Or if you want a little more context, you can go here under IM for community, law enforcement, or a developer. So in the community section, you might get more of an explanation about what some of this data means for law enforcement, you might get more of an explanation about how to produce this kind of data. And then for developers, you might get more technical information. What I wanted to show everybody was just sort of how this works. And so if you come here to the different types of data that we've got organized, you can pull up whatever you want to see. Here I'll pull up officer-involved shooting data. And then you can kind of scroll down and see here are all the agencies that are releasing data around the country related to officer-involved shootings. So every one of these agencies has made their data available in a different file format here. And when you click on these links, you actually go right to their data. And so you're able to work with it right there in that format. So here's Dallas's data. I actually went to it earlier, and you can see what Dallas is releasing. They're releasing for each officer-involved shooting, they're telling you the case number, the date that it occurred, the exact location where it occurred. These are not 100 blocks or just street addresses. These are exact locations. This tells you what kinds of activities took place. So whether or not it was a shooting where the subject was missed, or whether the subject was injured, or whether the subject was actually deceased. It tells you what kind of weapon the subject had, and so you can see here the various kinds of weapons that the person had. It tells you who the subject actually was, and also tells you about the officer. So who the officer was by name and by race, ethnicity, and gender. It tells you about the grand jury disposition. It provides you access to any of their government forms related to the case. And then it provides you a web access where you can actually go online and read about the actual incident. And so Dallas gives you access to all of this data. My understanding is that this is part of a Texas state law that all of this data has to be released. But what you can see here on the screen is that Dallas is using a particular, one particular tool that's out there that a lot of other agencies use. But if you're in a community, you can basically come up here and say, I want to visualize this data. And then when you visualize it, you can come down here and look at the map, figure out how to configure your map. As I've done here, I've checked that I wanted to see a heat map of this data. So this kind of shows you where you see this brightness is where the incidents are occurring with more frequency. So we can see for Dallas kind of where officer-involved shootings are occurring. So one of the other things that we did on the portal early on is we looked at where officer-involved shootings resulted in fatalities versus injuries. And we mapped those separately on this map. And then the other thing we did was we went in and plotted where the trauma centers are. And we looked at the trauma centers in location to these shooting incidents where people lived and people did not live. And it was interesting to see the relationship of where the trauma centers were. They happened to be very close to the places where people lived and not close to the places where people didn't live. And it kind of was to prove out this point that access to trauma care could make a great difference in reducing fatalities, both in officer-involved shootings as well as just non-officer-involved shooting incidents. So that's the kinds of things that a community can do with open data. Denise, do you want to give an example maybe of some of the work that you did in New Orleans? You all did some really interesting things down there together with the police department.
Yeah, well, the one emerging best practice that our jurisdictions have identified is as you're getting ready to publish data sets, that you might release a draft version of the data to a trusted group of community stakeholders. In New Orleans, their trusted group of stakeholders was a group of young coders, young software developers in training from low opportunity neighborhoods, and their tech mentors who sat down side by side with the police chief and the chief information officer and city tech staff to basically collaborate and work through the data and ask questions. And what the city team came away with from there is a lot of great intel on what they needed to do to improve the data so that it would be less likely to be misinterpreted when they did go public with it. The other fantastic community engagement that I'd like to talk about is quickly is in Orlando. They were unsure about what attributes they should be redacting that might compromise victim privacy, especially around domestic violence and sexual assault. So they brought in domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy groups along with civic technologists from the Code for America Brigade, and those folks sat down side by side with uniformed officers and city tech staff and dived right into the data and provided incredible guidance to the Orlando Police Department on how they should publish their data to deliver the most value that they could for community advocates while still protecting victim privacy. And through all of this, I think the best outcome is the incredible authentic engagement that you get when you have citizens sitting down to collaborate with police officers and city staff.
Thanks, Denise. I just want to, I'll show everybody here a couple of things that I talked about during the webinar. So this is Louisville Police Department's employee characteristics data. So you can see they tell you here for every employee in the police department where the person is assigned, their current age, the date they were hired, the ethnic group and gender, their highest education level, and their job title. So it doesn't tell you, who they are, but certainly you could take this data and roll it up and see. If you wanted to see how many Louisville Police Department employees are white versus Hispanic versus black, or how many are male versus female, how many are in training jobs versus on the job today, so you can see how their hiring might be changing over time, for example. You can do almost anything with this data because you can download it. You see here where it gives you the ability to download the file in a couple of different formats. Again, it doesn't have to be sophisticated. There are some agencies that have this kind of capability right on their home website so that you can download the data and do your own analysis. So that's an example. I'll also show you very quickly another example I just came across for Cincinnati. We can see they're placing citizen complaint data online, which is also kind of interesting. Oops, got a problem with that one. But agencies are very much in the process of trying to release additional data to give communities more insight into what takes place in policing. Cameron, do we have any questions or anything in particular that people would like to see?
We do have a question for the Independent Police Review Authority in Chicago. They ask, has the Police Foundation considered standardizing and compiling the data to create a national platform to analyze various aspects of policing, such as officer-involved shootings, calls for service, etc.?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So let me, for those who are on the call who this may be the first time that they're looking at open data, let me explain what happened. So we looked at Louisville, for example, and Louisville tells us about the employees in their agency. They told us where they're assigned, their race, their gender. I don't think they had a separate column for ethnicity. So let's say, for example, that Chicago wanted to release the same data, but Chicago decides that they want to provide ethnicity, and they may want to provide those breakdowns in a different way. When that happens, it makes it very difficult to compare Chicago with Louisville. So if there's no standardization in the data, it makes it difficult to compare agencies across sites. It doesn't make it impossible, but it certainly makes it a little more challenging. At the same time, prescribing a specific standard to agencies can make it more difficult for them to release data. So for example, if I want to release data on my employees in an agency, but you tell me that I have to do it in a certain way, and my system doesn't allow me to do that, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So that's sort of the challenge that we deal with, but certainly a standards-based data release or a standards-based open data platform is certainly something we've talked about. It's something that we aspire to in many ways and would love to see created. We are involved in a couple of data collections ourselves where we do have a standardized way of collecting data and defining the elements that we're collecting. And we have talked about how we as a police foundation can make that data available as opposed to the way it's traditionally done where we collect data and do research on it internally and then release data reports for everyone to see. We'd love to find a way to collect data from agencies and then release that data, or at least a subset of that data, in an open format. So then you do have that standardization across agencies. There's some challenges with that at the as far as what's called human subjects in data collection. We have to kind of work through, and what it really deals with is the privacy of individuals. So we have to make sure, as we collect data through federal grants, for example, that we're not releasing anything that's publicly identifiable or personally identifiable information, excuse me. So those are some of the challenges that we're trying to work through, but it's definitely a great question, a great thought, and I think that's the direction that we would like to see it go. Denise, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do want to say that it's a balance, and for the Police Data Initiative in this early phase, the primary audience is your local community and what data sets would be high value for them for better understanding policing and to build community trust. So that's the main focus, and that's why the data publishing happens at the local level. And then I think ultimately one day there may be some roll up, but we're still, I think, struggling too with apples and oranges issues, and documenting the data is going to be really important for making sure we're not inappropriately comparing data sets that aren't really the same across jurisdictions.
Great question, though. Thank you for asking.
We do have another question from the Office of the Inspector General of the New York Police Department. The question is, are there any safeguards in place to ensure that the data being provided by police agencies are complete and accurate? What is to stop an agency from tailoring the data that it provides to cast it in a more positive light?
Yeah, that is also a great question. I think part of this is, it goes back to the old adage, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So, the one thing about this, and this has come up in various ways in this initiative, is that I think we all have to remember that when we release data in an open format, it means that anyone can access it. So, in an agency of 1,000 employees, for example, when you release your data in an open format, all 1,000 people have access to that data in addition to the thousands of people in the community. So if there's something that you're hiding, it's probably not going to be a secret too long because of the way that data is released. That's my own perspective. But we don't have, at least Police Foundation doesn't have anything built into this process to guarantee that the data is complete. Denise, do you have anything you want to add to that?
One thing we are hearing from our jurisdictions is that the data quality improves once they start making it open. And certainly, when the public start interacting with the data and don't see their reality reflected in it, that begins a different type of dialogue. Sometimes it turns out that the data is not there because it's actually siloed in some other data set within a city's information systems. And so I've seen this happen across different types of data outside of policing, and the public will ask challenging questions, and that's part of the dialogue and part of the process of becoming more open.
Yeah, Denise, where was it recently? It seemed like you and I were together recently. Maybe it was on the webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago where you talked about how a citizen was participating in an event in their community, and they were looking at data and actually saw a call that they had made from their house showed up in the 311.
Yeah, that's Lamar, the Chief Information Officer for New Orleans, was talking about when they released their police data to this trusted group of stakeholders, they also released 311 data about citizen calls for service. And this young man named Demond found his grandmother's request for a recycling bin in the data set. And he remembered that she had just had that recycling bin delivered like last week. So it was amazing how that built trust in the data, him seeing his grandmother's request and knowing in the real world that had come full circle and she'd received the bin. And so that is one person explained this to me really well one time. There are two types of data users. There's fishermen and oceanographers. And often we think about data from the oceanographer perspective and the analysis that people will do. But really the value in building trust is the fishermen, the people who are just fishing for one piece of data at a time, and it confirms their reality or doesn't, as they're looking for those records in the data set. And if you have open lines of communication, so if they go fishing for a record and they don't find it, and you have a feedback loop in place, then that interaction can both improve the quality of the data and the context around it, and also help to build trust.
Great, thanks, Denise. It's another great question. There really isn't, as we mentioned, isn't anything built into the process, but the accountability that comes with it, I think, can't be overlooked. When you're pushing your data out far and wide, there's potentially a lot of eyes on it that could spot a potential problem with it.
David Gelting is asking, are agencies providing general contextual data, such as number of sworn officers, population, city demographics, etc.?
They are not providing that, but we are collecting that. We are doing it pretty much through UCR, which I know is not 100%, and it's usually a year or sometimes two behind. But we wanted to pull that data in. So you can see here on this page of the portal that shows you every agency that we have participating, and we've got some updating we need to do. We provide you with a link to that information based on UCR.
The next question is, are there analysis tools available in the Open Data Portal once data is uploaded without having to download it into a separate tool?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. We don't have any tools that we've published on the portal itself, but I think what I have seen people do is if they don't have access to Socrata or they don't want to use, I'll try to show you Dallas's data. You can see here that the Socrata tool that Dallas uses gives you the ability to access all of their visualization support. So this gives you the ability, if you want to visualize their data, you have lots of capabilities here. I'm not as skilled at it as others might be, so there may be other ways to look at this, but you can take advantage of this, or you could download the data directly into you can see the export capabilities here. You can download it into a CSV or an Excel file and use some of the analytical capabilities that are native to Excel. Any other questions, Cameron?
I am not seeing any more at this point. I don't know if anybody has another one. We do have time probably for one more.
Well, while we're giving folks a minute, Denise, did you have any comments that you wanted to offer in wrapping it up?
Yeah, well, I do want to emphasize that this is a community of practice. It's peer-to-peer learning with pretty solid support from the private sector to help reduce barriers that jurisdictions have opening their data. We view this as a process, not a final product. So Jim, you went to a link that was broken. That happens sometimes. And what our jurisdictions report out on every 2 weeks, we have a 30-minute stand-up phone call, and they talk about the challenges, for example, of they might start by manually posting a data set once every quarter, and then they find that it would be more useful to automate that process. And so then the jurisdiction starts working more closely with their tech department to automate the data updating. And it's all just part of a continuous process improvement, and it really, it's just a part of what modern policing is to build out these data supply chains, to make them publicly available, and then use that data to engage the public. And I'm just really proud of the great leadership that the jurisdictions have shown so far in figuring out the best and highest value way to do this, within given resource constraints. So we aren't expecting perfection. we're sort of all in it together, defining this field as we go. And that's why this next 9 months is so critical to really, chart the path forward in open data and policing. And thanks for having me on. This was a really great group. Good question.
Well, thanks for joining us, Denise. We appreciate
Absolutely.
it. For everyone out there, Denise didn't know about this webinar until about 20 minutes before we went on, and we told her about it, and she said, "I'd love to be there," and so we appreciate you making time to join us.
Thanks.
Cameron, any other questions?
No, that was it. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to bring up that last slide again for how to join the Police Data Initiative for those who have or who are interested in emailing and being a part of the initiative. With that, I want to thank you, Jim and Denise, for joining us today and providing us with an incredible amount of information and taking time to answer our questions. I also want to thank all of you out there for attending today's session and taking a moment to complete the online survey that will be sent to you shortly. I just want to remind all of you that this is just the first installment in our 2016 webinar series. Additional topics are being finalized now, and emails will be sent out soon. Topics such as police response to untreated mental illness, community engagement strategies, the role of journalists in promoting accountability and transparency, community police oversight in higher education, and partnering with community mediation centers to develop mediation programs. Once again, thank you for joining us as we continue our work to enhance accountability and transparency in policing. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.